Welcome to the Explainer. Okay, let's set the scene. It's early December 2025. The holiday season is kicking off, and suddenly, India's biggest airline, IndiGo, just stops. We're talking thousands of canceled flights, passengers stranded everywhere. So, in this Explainer, we're going to dig into the perfect storm that caused this massive aviation crisis, and more importantly, what it tells us about the real challenges of flying in one of the fastest-growing markets on the planet. And let's start with this quote from the Delhi High Court, because, honestly, it just perfectly captures the public's outrage. As IndiGo's entire network was collapsing, other airlines, well, their fares went through the roof, turning what was already a travel nightmare into a massive financial headache for thousands. And no, that's not a typo. 40,000 rupees. That's the one-way fare some people had to shell out for a ticket that, on any normal day, would cost you maybe 5,000. It's just a staggering number, and it really drives home how completely out of control the situation got.
So what on earth happened here? I mean, what could possibly trigger a meltdown this big? This wasn't just a bit of bad weather or some small technical problem. No, this was a total, complete operational failure that basically brought a huge chunk of India's entire aviation system to its knees.
It all kicked off on December 2nd, and the chaos just spread like wildfire. Seriously, try to picture it. At the absolute peak of this crisis, we're talking about at least 1,600 flights canceled in a single day. The country's biggest airports, Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore, they were just transformed into these seas of stranded, frustrated passengers. Their plans were completely up in smoke. It was like the nation's aviation backbone just snapped.
So how did this happen? Well, when investigators started digging, they found it wasn't just one thing. It was a perfect storm, a collision of two totally separate crises. You had the crew crisis. That was an internal problem, a planning failure that was absolutely avoidable. And then you had the fleet crisis, an external technical issue that had been simmering for a long, long time. Let's see how these two things smashed into each other.
All right, let's start with the pilot problem. This was the immediate trigger, and really, it was a totally self-inflicted wound that came down to new safety rules. Okay, so at the heart of this whole thing is something called FDTL. That stands for Flight Duty Time Limitation. Basically, these are super important safety rules meant to make sure pilots aren't overworked and dangerously tired. And on November 1st, new, much stricter rules kicked in. They gave pilots more required rest time every week, bumping it up from 36 to 48 hours, and also cut down on how many tricky night landings they could do.
Now, here's the absolutely wild part. The airline knew about these new rules for over a year. They had all that time to prepare, and yet they just didn't. They didn't hire enough new pilots. They didn't adjust their schedules. So when that November 1st deadline hit, they were caught totally flat-footed, which created this massive, sudden shortage of pilots.
So facing a crisis they created themselves, what did the airline do? Well, they reportedly tried some pretty desperate things, like offering to buy back leave days from their pilots. And as one critic put it, the message was basically, work more, rest less, we'll pay you for it. This, of course, completely goes against the entire point of the safety rules, which is to make sure your pilots are actually rested and safe to fly. But here's the thing. This huge internal mistake, this planning failure, it turned into a full-blown catastrophe because it slammed right into another problem, a chronic, long-term issue that had already left the airline incredibly weak.
And that number is over 40. Think about that. More than 40 of IndiGo's Airbus A320neo planes were already grounded, just sitting on the tarmac, totally out of service. And this was way before the pilot shortage even started. What that means is the airline had zero backup, no spare capacity, no wiggle room at all to deal with a shock. So what was wrong with them? The culprit was a global manufacturing flaw in their Pratt Whitney engines. Turns out, a contaminated metal powder was used to make some key parts, creating a risk that they could crack. This forced a massive worldwide recall. And the fix? Well, it's a logistical nightmare. Every single engine has to be sent for repairs that take between 250 and 300 days. That's almost a whole year. This took a huge chunk of their fleet right out of the sky.
So, you see the two pieces of the puzzle, right? You have the crew shortage, an avoidable short-term problem, crashing into the grounded fleet, a chronic, long-term problem. The airline had all these flights scheduled, but suddenly they didn't have enough pilots to fly the planes, and they had no spare planes sitting around to help pick up the slack. It was the worst possible combination.
Okay, so as this whole thing spirals completely out of control and starts paralyzing travel across the entire country, the government had to step in. And when they did, their action was both swift and really, really severe. Just look at how fast this escalated. On December 5th, the regulator, the DGCA, forms a committee to investigate. Just 5 days after that, the CEO of IndiGo is summoned by the Ministry of Civil Aviation to answer for this mess personally. And then, a day later, on December 11th, the government brought the hammer down. And this penalty just kept getting bigger. First, the DGCA ordered a 5% cut to IndiGo's winter schedule. But that wasn't enough for the Ministry of Civil Aviation. In a pretty unusual move, they stepped in and doubled it. The final order? A mandatory 10% reduction in their schedule, forcing the airline to cancel at least 216 domestic flights every single day. This was way more than a slap on the wrist. It was a huge, punitive message that this kind of failure was unacceptable.
So why are we digging so deep into this one crisis? Well, because it's not just an isolated incident. When you pull back the lens, you see that this whole episode shines a big, bright light on a tension that's been bubbling under the surface of Indian aviation for a long, long time.
I mean, it feels like history is just repeating itself. Go back to 2007 and 2008. The regulator tried to bring in strong rules about crew fatigue. What happened? The airlines protested, and the ministry basically ordered the rules to be put on hold. Safety took a backseat to commercial pressure. Now, fast forward to today. The rules finally get implemented, but a major airline isn't ready, causing a national crisis that forces the government to intervene to prioritize safety. It's the same exact story, a constant tug-of-war between safety and business.
And you have to ask, what allows this pattern to keep happening? Well, it might come down to a deeper systemic problem. Get this. Since 2006, the International Civil Aviation Organization, that's the UN's aviation agency, has been recommending that India set up an independent safety authority, one that's completely free from government or airline interference. And for almost 20 years, that recommendation has not been implemented. It leaves a system where commercial pressures can and do compromise safety.
Which brings us to the big, lingering question. When an airline's aggressive drive for expansion clashes head-on with mandatory safety rules, who ultimately makes sure the passenger gets a safe landing? In one of the fastest-growing aviation markets in the world, who is really making sure that safety always comes first?